Have you ever sat at the kitchen table, coffee in hand, and wondered when your relationship with your children became so distant? Maybe you raised them with all your heart, gave them everything you could, but now every phone call feels formal. Visits are short. Conversations are polite but cold, and you're left thinking, did I do something wrong? Or are we just too far apart now to fix anything? You're not alone. For many parents in their 60s, 70s, even 80s, the quiet tension with their grown children isn't just uncomfortable, it's heartbreaking. And yet, buried underneath the pain, there's often a question we're afraid to say out loud. Is this relationship even worth saving? That's not a cruel question, it's an honest one. You've lived long enough to know that not every bond can or should be forced. But you've also lived long enough to know that some relationships are still worth fighting for, even if they look nothing like what you once hoped for. Today, we're going to talk about how to recognize the difference. Let's take a deep breath together before we start, because this isn't going to be one of those 10 tips to fix your family videos. It's not about quick solutions or pretending everything's fine. It's about looking inward, maybe more deeply than you have in a long time, and learning what really shapes the bond between you and your children. And most importantly, whether that bond can grow again. The first thing to understand is this: every parenting choice involves a kind of emotional letting go. That may sound poetic, but it's also incredibly practical. From the moment your child takes their first steps, you're letting go. First, it's your hand. Then, it's control over bedtime. Then it's who they date, what career they choose, how they raise their own kids. Letting go isn't a one-time event. It's the very nature of parenting. But letting go doesn't mean giving up. It means grieving the version of your relationship that no longer exists, so you can make room for a new one. Maybe you miss when your son used to call you every Sunday, or when your daughter asked you for advice before making big decisions. Maybe those days are gone. And yes, that hurts. But clinging to what used to be won't bring those moments back. It just makes you bitter toward what is. So if you find yourself holding on to a version of your relationship that belonged to a different season of life, maybe it's time to pause and ask, what am I really grieving? Is it the child I once knew? The closeness I once felt? The version of myself I was when I felt more needed? When we stop to acknowledge that pain instead of running from it, we open ourselves up to something new, something present, something real. Now let's say part of you still wants to rebuild this relationship. You haven't completely closed the door. Maybe your child hasn't either. But you're stuck in silence or in arguments that never seem to resolve. What can you actually do? Where do you begin? Here's the truth that most people don't want to hear, especially parents. If you want to save your relationship with your kids, it has to start with you. That's not because everything is your fault. It's because change in a relationship rarely starts with waiting on the other person. It starts with modeling the behavior you wish to see. You see, we spend so much energy thinking about what our kids should do differently. She needs to stop shutting me out. He should be more respectful. They never call unless I remind them. But the harder question, the one that leads to real change, is this: what can I do differently? Now, that doesn't mean becoming a doormat or ignoring your own hurt. It means becoming curious. What if, instead of saying, "You never call," you said, "I miss talking to you"? What if, instead of criticizing their choices, you asked, "Help me understand why you see it that way"? When you shift your approach, you invite a new response. And even if your child doesn't change right away, you're taking the high road. You're showing maturity, humility, and a willingness to repair, not out of guilt, but out of love. One woman I spoke to told me she hadn't spoken to her adult son in over a year. Every interaction ended in tension. Finally, instead of sending him another article or voicemail telling him what he was doing wrong, she wrote a letter. A simple letter. In it, she said, I know we see things differently. I'm not writing to fix you. I'm writing to say that I still care, and I hope there's a way we can begin again." A month later, her son called. Not with an apology, but with a quiet willingness to talk. That was the first brick in a new bridge. The hardest part about rebuilding is accepting that you don't control the outcome. You only control the effort. And for many parents, that's terrifying. You've spent a lifetime doing everything you could for your kids. But now, in this season of life, the most powerful thing you can do isn't controlling, it's releasing. Releasing the need to be right. Releasing the stories you've told yourself about what they should be doing, and instead, embracing what's still possible. Now, let's talk about something that often hides beneath the surface of your conflicts with your kids, something many of us don't realize is even happening. You see, so many arguments between parents and adult children aren't really about what's being said in the moment. They're about something deeper, a clash of value systems, a difference in what each of you believes is normal, respectful, or right. Think about this for a second. You were raised in one generation, your kids in another. Maybe you believed in keeping emotions private. They believe in speaking every feeling aloud. You value structure. They value freedom. You think gratitude should look like obedience. They think it looks like open expression. Neither of you is wrong. But if no one says it out loud, it turns into judgment, distance, and misunderstanding. Sometimes conflict comes from something as simple as how the dishes get done. That sounds silly, but it's not. Maybe you were raised to wash up immediately after dinner. Maybe your kids prefer to relax first and clean up later. That small detail, left unspoken, can snowball into frustration. They don't respect the effort I put in. They don't care about cleanliness. But underneath it all, you're not just arguing about chores. You're arguing about feeling seen, feeling valued, feeling like you matter. You and your children are working from two different operating systems. If you've never updated the software of your relationship, you're probably still running on the beliefs and expectations of your upbringing. And so are they. But unlike a computer, people don't come with update notifications. We have to pause and ask, are we still trying to run today's relationship on yesterday's programming? Take a breath and let that sink in. If your child isn't meeting your expectations, it doesn't mean they're wrong. It might just mean their operating system is different. And instead of forcing yours onto them, or resenting them for not adopting yours, you can begin to ask, what might it look like to build a new system together? That question opens up a whole new way of relating. It doesn't mean giving up your values. It means realizing that connection doesn't come from winning. It comes from understanding. And that's what we're really reaching for, isn't it? Understanding. Closeness. The feeling that no matter how far apart we've drifted, there's still a thread that can be rewoven. Now that we've talked about the different value systems between parents and children and how our operating systems can quietly clash, it's time to look even deeper. Because if you've ever found yourself in a conversation with your child that started with something small, like a forgotten birthday call or a disagreement over how to discipline the grandkids, but suddenly it turned into a full-blown argument, you're not alone. Those arguments don't come out of nowhere. They usually build up slowly like steam inside a kettle until something finally blows. And when it does, we're often left wondering, why did things get so heated over something so small? The answer lies under the surface. Beneath every argument between a parent and child, especially once your kids are grown, there are usually three core issues being tugged at: power, trust, and value. You may not be arguing about those things directly, but they're there, quietly driving what's said, how it's said, and why it hurts so much. Let's start with power. You've probably heard someone say, this isn't a power struggle. But the truth is, most family conflicts are, at least on the outside. As parents, we spend decades guiding, correcting, and protecting our children. We're used to having a certain amount of authority. But when our kids grow up, that power dynamic has to shift. And that's not easy. Suddenly, they're making choices without asking for input. They're raising their own kids, managing their money, setting their own boundaries. And when we disagree or try to step in, they may push back. Not necessarily because they don't love us, but because they're trying to reclaim their own sense of autonomy. From our side, it might feel like disrespect. From theirs, it might feel like survival. One father told me his daughter barely spoke to him anymore after a heated argument about her husband. He had only wanted to offer advice. He thought he was being helpful, but she saw it as interference, and so she pulled away. When we talked through it, he realized that what hurt the most wasn't her rejection of his advice. It was the feeling that he'd lost his role in her life. That's the power piece. Next is trust. Not just whether you trust them, but whether they trust you. Do they trust you to listen without judgment? To hold space for their experiences, even when they differ from your own? And just as important, do you trust that your child is doing the best they can, even when their choices make you uncomfortable? Many parents hold on to a hidden fear. If I don't guide them, they'll mess everything up. But here's a question worth asking. Is your guidance based on fear or on faith? Do you still see them as someone who needs you to parent them, or as someone capable of standing on their own? When trust is missing, we tend to overreach. And when we overreach, they tend to retreat. Then there's the final piece, value. This one cuts deep. At the core of many parent-child conflicts is a simple but powerful question. Do you see me? Do you appreciate what I've done? Do I still matter to you? Think about it. You spent years, decades, sacrificing for your children. Sleepless nights, hard-earned money, worry you never even voiced. So when they forget to thank you or dismiss your opinion or seem distant, it's not just rude. It feels like erasure. Like you've become invisible in their lives. And yet, have you told them that? Or have you let it fester, showing up in sarcasm, disappointment, or silence? There was a woman I met at a community event who shared how her son rarely visited. She said he was selfish, wrapped up in his own world. But when I asked if she'd ever said, "I miss you," she paused. "No," she said quietly. "I just wait for him to figure it out." But most people don't figure it out on their own. They're too wrapped up in their own fears, their own insecurities, their own interpretation of the relationship. Your silence can be misread as indifference, your distance as rejection. That's why it's so important to name what's underneath. Because if you're constantly bumping into these same three issues, power, trust, value, you might be fighting about the dishes, or the phone calls, or how to handle Thanksgiving plans. But what you're really fighting for is something much deeper. And once you start to see that, everything changes. You stop trying to win the argument and start asking better questions. Instead of, "Why don't you ever listen to me?" you ask, "What are you feeling when I speak?" Instead of, "You never visit anymore," and you say, "Is there something between us that makes visits feel difficult?" It's not easy. It takes courage and humility. But those are things you've gained in spades over the years, even if you don't always realize it. Now let's turn inward a bit more, because there's one more layer that many of us never think to explore. And it's this. Sometimes the problem isn't what your child is doing or not doing. Sometimes it's how you react. And why? Because behind your reactions, there may be a deeper fear. Are you more afraid of losing your child or of losing yourself as a parent? Let that settle for a moment. So many parents give so much of themselves to their kids that they wrap their entire identity in the role. That's beautiful and dangerous. Because once your child grows up and doesn't need you in the same way, it can feel like a loss of purpose. And every disagreement, every boundary they set, can feel like a rejection, not just of your input, but of you. Maybe you grew up in a time when being a parent meant sacrifice without question. You did everything for your kids. You set aside dreams. You worked 2 jobs. You swallowed your pride to give them better lives. But if you were never taught how to separate love from control or care from identity, you might feel like backing off means disappearing. It doesn't. Loving your child in their adulthood means loving them in their difference. And loving yourself means knowing that you still matter, even when they no longer rely on you the way they once did. Some parents respond to that fear by clinging tighter, calling more often, giving advice that wasn't asked for, trying to fix things they're not responsible for. Others respond by pulling away, telling themselves, or fine, if they don't want me, I won't bother. But both responses come from the same place: pain. So here's a new way to look at it. What if losing control isn't the end of the relationship, but the beginning of a new one? One built not on dependence, but on mutual respect. Not on shared habits, but on shared love. One where you no longer have to be in charge to still be deeply important. Because you are. You always have been. And chances are, even if your child hasn't said it lately, a part of them still carries your voice, your lessons, your love. It's never too late to try again. But trying again means looking inward, just as much as reaching outward. It means recognizing what's really driving your reactions and being willing to face those fears instead of hiding behind anger or withdrawal. No matter how old your child is, you're still writing your story with them. The pen may have changed hands, but the next chapter is still waiting to be written together. There's something powerful that happens when we stop looking at our children as unfinished versions of ourselves and start seeing them as whole people. People with their own wounds, their own hopes, their own regrets. That shift doesn't just heal relationships, it transforms them. You may never get back the version of your relationship you once had. But what if you could build something better? Not louder, not closer in the way it once was, but more honest, more grounded, more resilient. To do that, you have to let go of one of the most dangerous ideas of all, that if your relationship is strained, it means you've failed as a parent. You haven't failed. You've done the hardest job in the world, raising a human being. And now, as they've become adults, you're being invited into the next chapter. One where love has to evolve, just like they have, just like you have. But here's what we often forget in that process. Sometimes your child is still reacting to a version of you from years ago. Maybe they remember the strict parent, the overwhelmed parent, the one who snapped when life was too heavy. They may not have caught up to the person you've become now, wiser, softer, more open, but they won't see that unless you show it. That's the quiet invitation of midlife and elderhood. To become someone who doesn't shout to be heard, but who speaks truth with compassion. Someone who doesn't demand connection, but invites it with presence. You don't need to have the perfect words. You don't need to solve all the tension, but you can show up. You can say, "I'm learning too." You can say, "I miss us." You can say, "Can we talk?" Not to fix, but to understand. You might be surprised how far those words go. Sometimes the most powerful healing begins not with answers, but with listening, real listening. The kind that doesn't rush to defend or correct. The kind that creates space for your child to say what's been sitting in their chest for years. That space is where trust begins to grow again. And in that space, your role doesn't disappear, it deepens. You're no longer just the one who provides. You're the one who reflects, who teaches, not through instructions, but through example, who shows that growth never ends, not at 30, not at 60, not at 90. And if your child is open, they'll meet you there. But what if they aren't? What if the phone stays silent? What if the conversation never comes? What if, despite all your effort, your child keeps their distance? That's one of the hardest truths to sit with. And it's why this conversation started with something many people avoid. The possibility that the relationship might not be worth saving, or at least not in the way you hoped. That doesn't mean giving up. It means recognizing what's in your control and what isn't. It means grieving what could have been and making peace with what is. It also means loving your child from afar, if that's all they allow. That love is still real, and your life is still full of meaning, whether or not they step back into it. Sometimes peace in a relationship isn't found through reconnection, it's found through release. Releasing the need to fix, to force, to hold onto a dream that no longer fits the reality. And from that place of surrender, you may discover something unexpected. Freedom. Freedom to rebuild other connections, to explore parts of yourself you left behind, to live not just as someone's parent, but as someone with your own story still unfolding. You've made it this far. You've weathered storms that younger people can't even imagine. You've been tested, stretched, hurt, and still you love. That kind of love has nothing to prove. It just is. So wherever your relationship with your kids stands right now, whether it's close, complicated, or cold, know this: you are not broken. And neither is your story. There's still time for new conversations, new beginnings, even new endings that bring closure rather than confusion. And if nothing else changes, let this change: how you treat yourself. Let go of the guilt. Let go of the shame. Hold on to your dignity. And when you speak to yourself, speak the way you always wanted your children to speak to you, with kindness. That, more than anything, is what healing looks like. It's not perfect, it's not always mutual, but it's real, and it's yours. If this message spoke to you, even just a little, I'd love to hear your story. What's been your biggest challenge with your kids as they've grown? What's helped you stay hopeful? Or what are you still struggling with? Leave a comment below and let's talk. You never know who your words might help. And if you found value in this video, please hit that like button and subscribe to the Strong Elderly Life channel. We're building a space where honesty, growth, and second chances aren't just talked about, they're lived. Every week we share insights and encouragement for living fully, loving wisely, and aging with strength. You're not alone. You never were. Here's to living your best life at any age. And here's to doing it with love, even when it's hard.